We bonded and we've had so much fun, played a little golf today. And, he's a great brother and he's a great apologist. And he honors us by speaking tonight. One of the things that I mentioned to him, some of you all heard the sermon of St. Mark's United Methodist Church pastor. Is it St. Mark's or St. Andrew's? St. Andrew's, UMC. And he was talking about a Christian nationalism. And he was saying, I'm not a Christian nationalist. One thing you know about Christian nationalism is, number one, it's not Christian and it's not American. And he said we should be welcoming of everybody. So Frank has written a great book, Legislating Morality, which yours, mine, or ours, I believe that's the subtitle of it, and a great book that deals with some of those things. And he's going to be dealing with some of those issues tonight with, what is, as Christians, the political realm and all that. So I'm going to turn it over to Frank and give you the mic.
All right.
And it's all yours.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, Dick Winston. All right, so how many of you have heard me before, or this is your first time? How many of you are here? How many don't respond to surveys? That's what we need to know. All right, I want to go back 21 years to the United States Senate when this guy, Sam Brownback, he was the senator from Kansas, they had a debate on partial birth abortion way back in October of 2003, and he had this picture of a 21-year-old or 21-week-old fetus in the womb. They were operating in the womb on this baby to save this baby's life, 21 weeks gestation to correct a birth defect. And he showed this picture. You can see the hand embracing the finger of the doctor. Here's a better picture. As you can see, the arm coming out of the womb there. And what he did is he basically asked a question of people in the room, other senators. He said, is little Samuel's hand, because ironically the kid was born and named Samuel, just like the senator, is little Samuel's hand the hand of a person, or is it the hand of a piece of property? And Senator Barbara Boxer from California said this, I am not a doctor and I am not God. I trust other human beings to make these decisions. Now, ladies and gentlemen, do you have to be a doctor or God to know that that's a human being? No. And when she says she trusts other people to make these decisions, what are lawmakers supposed to do? They're supposed to make decisions on issues like this. We vote them in. We're not a democracy. We're a representative republic. We send them to Washington and our state and local governments, and they represent us. They're the ones that are supposed to make the decisions on issues like this. That's what laws do. That's what lawmakers do. So what I want to do is talk about, does Jesus trump your politics? Because we're in an election year now, and issues like abortion are going to come up, and many other issues. And how are we as Christians supposed to respond? How are we supposed to conduct ourselves in a very hostile environment? And we should do this in 3 steps. First question we need to answer is, can we legislate morality? Because you always hear you can't. And apparently Dick's that guy from the United Methodist, which is no longer a church. It's now some club for leftists because they don't believe the Bible anymore. He said you can't legislate morality. Did he say that in there? Okay, you always hear that people say that. Is that really true? Hey, you're stealing my thunder, Scotty. I'm getting there. Well, you're an attorney. You know this, okay? But the general public buys into that. The second question is, should Christians be involved in politics? Because again, this United Methodist pastor was essentially saying no, and many people will say no. You're a Christian nationalist if you do that. And then finally, what should we do when we have 2 bad candidates? Not that I have anybody in mind, okay? But look, can we be honest here? Yes. Both of these guys have moral problems, all right? I know you might love one and hate the other or vice versa, but don't sugarcoat this. You've got to admit that both of these guys are really problematic when it comes to their personal behavior. Okay? So how do you deal with that? When those are the two choices you have, Kennedy is not going to be president. All right? Robert Kennedy, not going to be. Jill Stein, not going to be president. Okay? It's going to be Biden or Trump if Biden lives that long. I don't know if he'll make it. One guy said, look, we got two choices. We can vote for Orange Man or a cadaver. That's where we are. All right? So I got to warn you that we're going to be correct, not politically correct in here, if that's okay. Is that okay? I don't care if it is. It might be a good title, Pat. Good idea. Yeah. I don't care if you don't care because I'm going to be correct, not politically correct. All right, let's start right here. Can we legislate morality? Let me ask you a question. These are all issues that are debated publicly and about politics, abortion, life, marriage, men and women's sports now, transitioning children, parental rights, murder, theft, and rape. Do we legislate on these issues? Are these moral issues? Yeah, so we legislate morality all the time. As Scotty just said, all laws legislate morality. The only question is whose morality will be legislated. You can't think of a law that doesn't say one behavior is right and the opposite behavior is wrong. That's what laws do. It's impossible to legislate no moral position. Every law has some sort of moral component to it. You ought to do this, and you ought not do this. Even speed limits are moral laws. Why? Why do we have speed limits? Because we think life is important. And if you're too reckless driving, then you're going to kill yourself or somebody else. It's really it's pro-life to have speed limit laws. So all laws legislate morality. The only question is whose morality? And I'll get to that in a minute. But whenever you bring this issue up, people are immediately going to say the separation of church and state. Okay, does anyone know the origin of this phrase? You do. Don't. All right, attorneys, shut up. All right, non-attorneys. Where did this come from, this phraseology, the separation of church and state? Does anyone know? It came from Jefferson. Now, Jefferson, where? All right, Thomas Jefferson said this. Where did he say it? Is it in the Constitution? Well, actually, no. Jefferson was president. It was 1803. The Constitution was written, and the First Amendment was ratified in 1791. Where was Thomas Jefferson when the First Amendment was ratified? Does anyone know? He was in France. He was the ambassador to France. He had nothing to do with the Constitution. Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence. James Madison is the primary architect of the Bill of Rights and the Constitution. So you're not going to look to Jefferson to figure out what the First Amendment means. You're going to look to Madison. But the phraseology came from a Thomas Jefferson letter that he was writing to the church in Danbury, Connecticut, a Baptist church, the Danbury Baptists. And the Danbury Baptists were worried that the federal government was going to interfere with their church. And so Jefferson writes in this 1803 letter to them and says, no, there is a wall of separation between church and state. And what he meant was not that the church couldn't influence the state. He meant that the state couldn't tell the church what to do. It was a one-way wall. Well, in 1947, a Supreme Court decision decided to import Jefferson's language into a court case, dicta, which is an opinion, a Supreme Court opinion. And since that time, people have erroneously thought that the separation of church and state is in the Constitution, when it is not. But even if it was, it's irrelevant. Why? Because we're not trying to tell people they have to be a member of a church. We're not trying to tell people that they have to be a member of a religion. We're not trying to tell people where, when, how, or if to worship. Laws aren't doing, well, there are people that want to do that. You know who they are? They're called Muslims. They want to impose Sharia law on the country, which would be against the First Amendment. But Muslims want to do that. Most Christians don't. There's a few that do. They want to impose the Old Testament law. But that's a very, very extreme group and a small group. Christians don't want to legislate religion, but we do want to legislate morality because it's unavoidable. Everybody's trying to legislate a moral position. Now, here's the problem. When you say you're going to legislate morality, people are going to say, but don't impose your morality on me. Now, what's the problem with this? Does anyone know?
Except lawyers.
Except, well, lawyers, if you got to jump in, help us out. What's the problem?
Well, it's a contradiction.
How are they doing the same thing, Scotty? Yeah, is this a moral position? Yeah, it's a moral position. Notice that? I mean, look at it this way. If someone were to say, don't impose your morals on me, you could simply turn the claim on itself and ask them, then why are you imposing that morality on me?
And that's what that United Methodist pastor was doing. His moral.
Of course. Everybody's trying to impose a moral. He was trying to say LGBTQ and all this is good. And we ought to put that into law. You see, those are all moral positions. The only question is, what is the right moral position? And when people say, don't impose your morality on me, I say, why not? Would that be immoral? Because you're imposing your morality on me right now. You're saying I ought not impose ought nots. You notice that? Why do you get to impose that ought not on me? Why do you get to impose ought nots, but I don't? You're doing the same thing you're saying that I can't do. But actually, the better answer is this. When somebody says, don't impose your morality on me, I think you ought to say this. This isn't my morality. I didn't make this stuff up. I didn't make up the fact that murder's wrong, that abortion's wrong, that you ought not try and mutilate children. I didn't make up the fact that rape is wrong, that theft is wrong, that men were made for women and women were made for men, and the best way to perpetuate and stabilize society, which is the reason the government's involved in marriage to begin with, is to legally recognize that man-woman relationship over every other relationship. I didn't make any of this stuff up. It's not my morality. It's not your morality. It just happens to be the morality. The one Thomas Jefferson said was self-evident, and the one the Apostle Paul in Romans chapter 2 says, the Gentiles who are not of the law have the law written on their hearts. So that's where Jefferson got it from, the same natural law that's expressed in the Bible, and he expressed it in the Declaration of Independence. It comes from the same source, God, but you don't need the Bible to know it. You know certain things are right and other things are wrong. In fact, this has been true forever. If you needed a Bible to know right from wrong, then God was unjust for judging the entire generation of Noah, right? They didn't have a Bible. How did they know they were doing wrong? Because there's a moral law written on the heart. Okay, so I don't want to impose my morality. I don't want to impose your morality. I want to impose the morality. Now, I always say to people, look, if you have a problem with the morality, you don't have a problem with me. I didn't make it up. You have a problem with the Creator upon whose nature this morality is derived. And isn't it interesting? It seems like every 10 minutes in our country, there's a new set of rights people are advocating. Do you notice that? Do you realize if there's no God, there are no rights? There's not only no trans rights, there's no Christian rights. There's not only no right to same-sex marriage, there's no right to natural marriage. There's not only no right to abortion, there's no right to life. Why? Because if there is no God, everything's just a matter of opinion. Just your opinion against somebody else's opinion. And it's interesting, there was a lady on MSNBC a couple of months ago who said, these Christians, these Christian nationalists, they think rights come from God. Well, where else do they come from? What does our founding document say? We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men were created and endowed by their government. No, endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. If there's no God, there are no rights. All right, so all laws legislate morality. The only question is whose morality? Now, should Christians be involved in politics? If I only have 10 seconds with somebody to convince them that Christians ought to be involved in politics, I show them this right on their iPhone. Does anyone know what this is? Yeah, that's the Korean Peninsula. We fought a war over this. This is 38th parallel. This is South Korea. Of course, this is North Korea. This is a homogeneous population of Koreans. As you can see, the South has productivity, it has freedom, it has the gospel. The North, on the other hand, is a concentration camp. There's one central reason for the difference. What's the reason? Don't say electricity. Why are these two countries so different? Politics. The South has political freedom, the North does not. Which country would you rather live in? Obviously. Politics affects your life in almost every way. I mean, think about this. Politics affects your church, your family, your health, your money, your business, your freedom, your property, your school, your safety, the poor, the unborn. Evangelism, your faith behavior, and everyone and everything. Why do I say evangelism? Because can you go out on the street corner in North Korea? How about in Tehran? How about in Riyadh? No, you know there's no First Baptist Church of Tehran. There's no Calvary Chapel of Jeddah, right? There's no United Methodist Church of Beijing, thank God, right? No, because politically they've ruled it out. If for no other reason you ought to be engaged politically is to protect your right to preach your faith and live your faith. We take it for granted in America we have religious freedom. It's going away, friends, because Christians are asleep at the switch. In fact, governments are necessary because, as Paul writes in Romans 13, the servant, or he's the servant, the leader. In his day, of course, it was an emperor. In our day, we have presidents and congresses and all that. But he was essentially saying that the man in charge doesn't bear the sword for nothing. What did he mean? That you need a certain amount of government to protect innocent people from evil. If you have no laws, you're going to have anarchy. Oh, people are inherently good. No, they're not. What do you think would happen if tonight the Denver police said, tomorrow you can do anything you want, you'll never be prosecuted? What do you think would happen? Huh? How many people would be shot? How many people would be raped? Would the Best Buys survive? Would the Lexus dealers survive? Nothing. It would be bedlam. Why? Because we're inherently evil. It's easy to be bad. It's hard to be good. If you have a 2-year-old, you know what we mean, right? They don't call it the terrible twos for nothing, right? And there's probably nothing more pithy said about government than James Madison, the father of our Constitution, when he said this in Federalist 51, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. I mean, do angels need to be governed? No, because they're angels, right? We're not. That's why we need a government. People are inherently flawed. And this is one of the differences generally between conservatives and liberals. Conservatives believe that people are inherently flawed and we want to conserve what's good. Liberals believe that people are inherently good and we just need to break them free of any restraints. That's a problem because that's not human nature. Human nature is you'll take as much as you want and work as little as you can. In reality, the people on the left think, oh, people are going to work as much as they can and take as little as they need. No, that's not the way it works. We're all fallen. In fact, the Babylon Bee has verified this. I don't know. You guys know the Babylon Bee? This is my favorite source in fake news. Study finds 100% of men would eat any fruit given to them by a naked woman. Okay. You know that's true, right? Doesn't matter what God said, okay? A naked woman offers you fruit, you're going to eat it. You say, I would have done better than Adam. No, you wouldn't. You'd have done the same thing. All right, so how should you love your neighbor? You might not know your neighbor across the way over there. How can you, if you never meet him, you never see him, how do you love him? Well, one way you do it is you ensure laws are put in place that protect him or her. In fact, let me ask a couple of questions. Should Christians care how people are treated? Every Christian, liberal to conservative, is going to say yes. Okay, next question. Should Christians care how people are treated by their government? Well, if you answer yes to this, of course you're going to have to say yes to this. Welcome to politics, ladies and gentlemen. You can't avoid it. It's just part of how we treat one another. And are we just to stand on the sidelines when innocent people are being harmed because laws aren't put in place to protect them? In fact, is there any of your life where you should not follow Jesus and the apostles? No, you should follow Jesus and the apostles in every area of your life, not just on Sunday morning or Wednesday night. But at your work, in your home, in the voting booth, Jesus should govern everything we do. It's the government right there. You can't be doing this. You shouldn't be doing this, all right? So the point is that every area of your life, whether it's how you govern your home or how you govern your nation, should be directed by Jesus and the apostles, by the scriptures. Now, of course, as New Testament Christians, we believe the New Testament is really our standard here. And of course, the natural law, which comes from the same source. Now, there is some confusion among Christians. This is where Christian nationalism comes in, okay? So-called Christian nationalisms. Here are 4 options for the Christian citizen, right? You could have the flag over the cross. You could have the cross and the flag equal. You could have just the cross, or you can have the cross over the flag, okay? Now, the first one here is idolatry and corruption. Some on the extreme might be what people are trying to smear you as a Christian nationalist, that you actually think your nation is more important than your faith. And that's never going to be the case. This would be idolatry. Your nation is not more important than Jesus, okay? If you put them side by side, that's also idolatry and confusion. If you say they're equally important, they're not equally important. If you just have the cross, and a lot of Christians just say, well, I'm not getting involved in politics. That's dirty. We shouldn't get involved. Separation church and state, don't impose your morality. You know, all those stupid things we already talked about. You may think you're loving God, but you're certainly not loving your neighbor. Because now do you think only atheists are qualified to make laws? Where does that idea come from? If you put this in the proper relation, the cross over the flag, then you're loving God and loving your neighbor. Here you're neglecting your neighbor. Here you're loving God and your neighbor. This is the proper way of looking at it. Now, unfortunately, people on MSNBC and CNN, the Communist News Network, when they call you a Christian nationalist, they don't really care about the cross. They just don't want you involved politically at all. It's just a smear word is all it is. Why don't they, instead of saying Christian nationalists, why don't they call the other side secular internationalists? Because that's exactly what is trying to be imposed. You've got the World Economic Forum led by Klaus. That's just such a great Bond name, isn't it? Klaus Schwab. Sounds like he should be a Bond villain over there in Switzerland. And they want a one world government. They want to take away the powers that we have to govern ourselves here. That's secular internationalism. Why do they think that they can impose that, but we can't impose what we could perceive to be Christian nationalism? Actually, we don't really call it Christian nationalism. We're imposing the natural law that Thomas Jefferson said was self-evident. You don't even need to be a Christian to know this, that certain things are right and other things are wrong. So this appears to me to be the proper view. Now you might say, well, have Christians really been successful in politics? Let's take the long view. This is the past 2,000 years. You ready? Christians have politically abolished slavery, gladiatorial combat, death games, temple prostitution, kidnapped brides, wives' property, infanticide, child labor, child marriage, child sex abuse, child prostitution, class distinctions, and now in some states here, abortion. Is this important? Would we have Western civilization without Christianity? No. In fact, even some secularists are starting to admit, even Richard Dawkins himself, the most famous atheist in the world who wrote The God Delusion and has been fighting against religion and Christianity for decades, recently came out and said, you know, I really like our Christian traditions. And he's really concerned about encroaching Islam. And he said, if I had to choose to live in a society, I'd much rather live in a Christian society than a Muslim society. And yet here he's been fighting against the very thing that can save civilization, Christianity. You know what's going to happen in Europe? It's inevitable unless Christians wake up. Islam's going to take over just through reproduction. They can have 4 wives and they can have 8 kids and 10 kids, and we're having 1.1 per couple. So Christians have been involved and should be involved. In fact, all of these people in the Bible were involved politically. Even Jesus himself. You say, Jesus was involved in politics? Where was he involved in politics? Who was his biggest adversary that he would always scold? And who were the Pharisees? Religious and political leaders. Why? Because some of them were on the Sanhedrin, that was the Jewish ruling council, to whom Rome delegated day-to-day lawmaking authority. In other words, these were the politicians of Israel. And Jesus scolded these people over and over again. In fact, in one spot, this is easy to remember, it's Matthew 23:23. Matthew 23:23, here's what Jesus says. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You give 1/10 of your spices, mint, dill, and cumin, but you've neglected the more important matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. You should have practiced the latter without neglecting the former. You blind guides, you strain out a gnat, but swallow a camel. Notice, the more important matters of the law. He's scolding the politicians for tithing their spices, but neglecting the more important matters of the law. And Jesus today would say the same thing to our politicians. We're telling people what light bulbs we can and can't use. We're telling people what cars they can and can't drive, but we won't say don't murder your children. In fact, we will tell them, oh, you want to get an abortion? Come to our state. We'll pay for it. It's the exact opposite. Woe to those who call evil good and good evil. We're calling evil good and good evil. Jesus would scold us in the same way because we're neglecting the more important matters of the law. Look, politics is not our religion, but politics affects our religion. And our religion should affect our politics. Does that make sense? All right, now, let's get to the key point. What should we do when we have two bad candidates? The Babylon Bee told us, despite negative reviews, Trump versus Biden renewed for second season. Okay. So this is where we are now, ladies and gentlemen. In North Carolina, where I live, I voted for DeSantis in the primary because I think DeSantis is a good candidate and he doesn't have all that baggage that Trump has, but he didn't get any traction for whatever reason. You know, probably one of the reasons he didn't get any traction was because the left kept coming after Trump, and Trump's now starting to look like a sympathetic character. And if they throw him in jail, he's going to become a martyr. He'll be elected while he's sitting in jail, assuming we have a fair election, and that's kind of a hard assumption. I certainly believe that Biden got more ballots in the last election, but I'm not sure he got more votes. So, in any event, notice that if you're going to decide who you're going to vote for, first of all, you need to remember that when you're voting, you're not voting for one person. You're voting for 5,000 people to go to Washington, D.C. and implement a platform. Because there's a Republican platform and a Democrat platform, you're not voting for one guy. When people say, you're going to vote for Trump, I say I'm voting for the platform. Because 75% of the time, the people that go there are going to support their platform. And what I'm going to do is show you the platform. Before I do, I want to point out that there is a moral hierarchy. You might be able to find things you like in both platforms. However, you can't neglect the more important matters of the law. You can't be tithing your spices and letting babies be ripped apart, letting children be mutilated, letting other concerns take religious freedom away from people, allowing sex trafficked children to come over an open border along with drugs and terrorism. And how do we know there's a moral hierarchy? We could go through several passages. We don't have time, but you're going to recognize some of the phraseology that Jesus used. He talked about the greatest commandment, greater love, greater sin, greater judgment, greater knowledge equals greater punishment. And he talked about the more important matters of the law. Not all sin is the same. All sin separates you from God, but not all sin is equally egregious. Just like not all virtuous acts are equally virtuous. And I mean, that just makes sense even in our own law system, right? You don't necessarily go to jail for jaywalking, unless you're Donald Trump. You might go to jail for murder, but not jaywalking. okay? And I guess the question's going to come up, well, does abortion trump everything else? Well, let me ask you this. What do you think Jesus would think about this? I mean, if we had the laws in Colorado, in Israel in the first century, Mary could have aborted Jesus. Elizabeth could have aborted John the Baptist. In fact, I think one of the most pro-life passages, other than thou shalt not murder, in the Bible is Luke chapter 1. Because in Luke chapter 1, when Mary comes to visit Elizabeth, what does it say about the babe in Elizabeth's womb? It says the choice leapt for joy. No, it didn't say the choice. It said the baby leapt for joy. There's a baby in there. We know that. It's not a choice. It's not a fetus. It's not a squirrel. It's not a raccoon. There's a human being in there. You can see that. Oh, it's not fully developed. But some teenagers aren't fully developed either. We can't kill them. Well, maybe we ought to revise our laws. Right? In fact, so here's what I want to do. And here's my thesis right off the bat. See if you agree with this. No president or politician is going to be our savior. True? Okay. But no spouse is going to be our savior either. Yes, yet it's still important that you choose the right one. Do you agree? Okay, not everything's about salvation. It's still important, however. And politics affects our ability to actually preach and live the gospel. So let's take a look at the platforms now. These are the national party platforms or policies. These are actually from 2020 because the 2024 ones haven't been written yet. They will be written in the next few months as they come up to the conventions, actually the next month or so. And here are some of the more important matters of the law. Okay, so where do these parties stand on these two issues? Abortion, Democrats want to pay for it. You remember when Bill Clinton was president? He said, I want abortion to be safe, legal, and rare. Whatever happened to that? Safe, legal, and rare. You never hear that anymore. Now it's shout your abortion. Come here. It's a sacrament. It's satanic. We need dead babies. And to have mothers want to do this. Now, I got to say this when we talk about abortion, because a lot of people had abortions. I'm not here to condemn anybody if you've had one. I'm here to prevent future abortions. And no matter what you've done, that all goes under the cross of Christ. But we shouldn't be for this politically. Of course, Republicans want to ban it or restrict it. There's going to be a fight in the 2024 platform because we know the country is not for a full ban. DeSantis got a 6-week ban in Florida, and different states are going to have different laws. But what is the Republican platform going to say? Okay? Is abortion everything? Are you a one-issue voter? No, I'm not a one-issue voter. You know what I am? I'm a one-issue disqualifier. I want my candidate to be good on all these issues. But if you're not good on that, you're disqualified. Right? If you don't understand the right to life is the right to all other rights. If you don't have life, you don't have anything. If you don't understand life, all these other secondary issues, I mean, imagine you had a candidate that was really good on the economy. He was going to bring life back into the economy. He was going to build great roads. He was going to get military back in shape. He was going to restore our institutions, but he wanted to kill Jews. Would you vote for him? Yeah, if you did, you just voted for Hitler. How about religious freedom? Restricted. Why is it restricted? Because anything LGBTQ overpowers religious freedom. Republican, unrestricted. I can't even believe we're talking about this. Transitioning children. The Democrats are for it. Joe Biden, on March 31st, 2022, essentially said, if you have a young kid, suppose Gunner were to say, a year from now, I'm a girl, and you didn't agree with it, that the government could come into your house and take him from you. Shots will be fired. That's when civil war starts. I'm not advocating that. I'm simply saying the government's going to come and take your kid and put him on hormone blockers, cross-sex hormones, and surgery. That's what the Democrats are for. Republicans, of course, against it. Judges. We're going to put law-making judges up there
Republicans generally want to put law applied, although the Democrats are better at choosing judges that do this than Republicans. I've seen many so-called conservative judges become liberal. I've never seen a liberal judge become conservative. In fact, why did we have Roe v. Wade? Because it's not in the Constitution. It were liberal judges, many of them put on there by Republicans. Harry Blackmun, who wrote the decision, the 7-2 decision, was actually appointed by Richard Nixon, I believe. Maybe somebody before, I can't remember. But he's appointed by a Republican. In any event, they made the law. There's nothing in the Constitution about abortion, just like there's nothing in the Constitution about marriage. It's a state issue. And Anthony Kennedy, the worst justice in the history of the United States Supreme Court, who gave us Planned Parenthood versus Casey and also gave us the Obergefell decision, which imposed same-sex marriage on all the states. He was nominated by Ronald Reagan. You know why he was nominated by Ronald Reagan? Because Judge Bork, you may have heard of him, was borked. He was like the third choice for Reagan, a Sacramento judge. That should have been his first warning system. But of course, Reagan, being a Californian, picked a Californian judge, and he was awful. How about race-neutral policies? You're not going to believe this, but it's true. They're against race-neutral policies. Republicans are for it. In fact, if you don't believe me, I'm just going to read 2 sentences from the Democrat platform. Here it is. Page 40. Democrats are committed to standing up to racism and bigotry in our laws, in our culture, and in our politics, and in our society, and recognize that race-neutral policies are not sufficient to rectify race-based disparities. Translation, we're going to use race to treat you differently. I don't know about you, friends, but introducing new racism to solve old racism doesn't solve it. And the Supreme Court has come out against this. That's why there are some now, even UNC Chapel Hill just got rid of their DEI program. Why? Because the Supreme Court says you can't use race. They certainly slapped Harvard around. You can't use race to decide who you're going to admit and who you're not going to admit. That's unconstitutional. Yet the Democrats have it in their platform. By the way, do you know they've added a new letter to DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion? You know what the new letter is? J for justice. Sounds so good. Jedi, doesn't it? I'm for Jedi. Justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. In fact, a friend of mine was at a business meeting in Charlotte when one CEO got up and said, I'm for Jedi. If I was there, I'd have loved to have raised my hand and said, sir, does your secretary make as much as you do? Oh no, so you're not for equity then. You're for justice. Because you're more valuable to the company, you bring in more revenue than your secretary, you should make more. You see, justice and equity are opposites many times. Justice, you get what you deserve. Equity, everyone gets the same. It's incoherent. But that's where we are. School choice, of course, against. Republicans are for. Border, that's pretty obvious. It's open. Although he's trying to say, I'm going to have an executive order to close it. He could have closed the border at any time. He's the guy that opened it. And of course, Republicans want it closed. Now, I'm for immigration. We should have immigration, but it should be legal immigration. And everybody believes in borders. Anyone who says, I don't believe in borders, I say, do you have a lock on your door? Oh, you do. Why? That's a border. Why? Because of safety. You don't just let anybody into your house. You don't let anyone into your country for a reason. There's a safety issue here. So when you look at these 2 platforms, remember you're voting for a platform, not just a person. What lines up more biblically? Yeah, sorry, it does. Now, I'm not a Republican, I'm a Christian. It just so happens that the Republican platform lines up better with natural law in the Bible than does the Democrat platform, which is actually 180 out from it. But if 20 years from now, the Democrat platform looks like this and the Republican platform looks like this, I'm voting Democrat. I don't care what the label is. It's the policies I'm concerned with. Does this make sense? All right, so does Jesus trump your politics? Can we legislate morality? The answer is That's all we can legislate. Yes, that's every law legislates morality. Should Christians be involved in politics? Of course, I think everyone should be involved in politics. Everyone who's informed should be involved. You should care about your neighbor and yourself and your children. What should we do when we have two bad candidates? Vote the platform. That's what you're going to have to do. Vote the platform. Now, one last thing. Does anyone know who Dietrich Bonhoeffer was? Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a German pastor in Germany during the rise of Hitler. And he was actually involved in the Valkyrie plot to kill Hitler in July of 1944. You've probably seen the movie with Tom Cruise. Well, Dietrich Bonhoeffer apparently was somehow implicated in that. And after that, Hitler went after a lot of people, and Bonhoeffer was ultimately hung in the Buchenwald concentration camp in April of 1945, just a week or two prior to the Allies liberating the camp. And he's written a number of books. One is called The Cost of Discipleship. And of course, Eric Metaxas wrote a great biography of him called Bonhoeffer. That's an international bestseller, well worth reading. In any event, coming up to 1945, from 1933 when Hitler took over, Bonhoeffer, and even Eric Metaxas is saying this now, the church in Germany basically was silent when Hitler was taking over. And Metaxas is saying now, that's what's happening in America. Think Germany, 1933. The church is quiet. We can't get involved in this. It's too controversial. Somebody might not like us. Instead of standing for truth, trying to protect you, your children, and your neighbor. There was a group in Germany during World War II called the Oxford Movement that wanted to try and convert Hitler. They thought that was the solution. And here's what Bonhoeffer said about how Christians have to be involved. He said, mere waiting and looking on is not a Christian behavior. The Christian is called to sympathy and action, not in the first place by his own sufferings, but by the sufferings of his brethren, for whose sake Christ suffered. In other words, he's saying, we just can't sit on our hands while our brothers are suffering. We've got to do something. We can't be silent. And so Bonhoeffer decided he was going to do something. And then here's what he said about the Oxford movement. He said the Oxford movement was naive enough to try and convert Hitler, a ridiculous failure to recognize what is going on. We are the ones to be converted, not Hitler. Do you see his point? We're not acting as Christians already. We think we're going to just convert Hitler and suddenly he's going to see things our way? If we started acting like Christians, Hitler wouldn't even be here. We're the problem. And it's important, ladies and gentlemen. Why? Because I want to live in a country like South Korea, not North Korea. How about you? So we have to be engaged.